Hey, it's Janine. Welcome to Bipolar She. We're going to jump into the show because we have so much to talk about. Today, I sit down with Dr. Norman Farb, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, where he studies the neuroscience of human identity and emotion. He is co-author with Zendel Siegel of the new book, Better in Every Sense: How the New Science of Sensation Can Help You Reclaim Your Life. I found this research illuminating and potentially a game changer for so many of us that struggle with depression or for those just feeling stuck in a rut. Research has proven that when we move into the mode of sensation, we can start a sense-foraging journey to improve our mental health. We begin the episode by looking at what's going on in the brain of someone under stress or dealing with depression. We learn about how we all operate primarily from a neural network in the brain called the default mode network or house of habit. It's the epicenter of our idea of self, of judgment, and what habituates us for survival. And it gets ramped up with sadness and anxiety. And then we turn to research done with functional MRIs, where the brain lights up in the scanner. And the research has shown when people are in the scanner watching sad movie clips, like a clip from the tearjerker Terms of Endearment, sadness inhibits a region in the brain that takes in sensory information. Also using fMRIs, we've learned by tuning into sensation or using sense foraging, which extends from mindfulness practices, the brain can change over time with increasing activity in the parts that interpret sensation, which then can be a predictor of someone staying out of depressive episodes. Next, we discuss how you actually perform sense foraging practices in your daily life. Dr. Farb talks about the salience network, which is a neural network that responds to sensory inputs. We learn that if we forage for insight, we can improve difficult interpersonal relationships and make deeper connections with others. We learn about story as a superpower and how we don't take advantage of how much we can do to positively project new futures through story. At the end of the interview, we talk about an amazing study which proved that incorporating mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, including elements of sense foraging, they were able to successfully wean patients off their antidepressants. And now on with the show. Welcome, Dr. Farb. Thanks so much for coming on the show. So the book you've written, I was fascinated by it. And as I mentioned before, it just stopped me in my tracks when I heard about the science of sensation and how with depression, we're less able to take in our world through sensation. The science does mirror the actual feelings of depression that people report, that numbness or even the flat affect. Is this showing up in the body and brain?
Yeah, I think so. There's sort of a complicated, but not that complicated pattern of things going on when someone is really suffering from mental illness, especially mood or anxiety disorders, where at one level there's a kind of hypersensitivity to threat or to negative information. So it's like imagine a fire alarm that goes off just when you make toast and you're like, oh, come on, like I'm just making toast. I'm not burning down the house. But that alarm means like something is seriously wrong. So it's like that alarm system seems like it's hypersensitive, but then the response to constantly having this alarm go off, understandably, is to then try to say like, well, I need to stop the signals that are setting this alarm off. So imagine saying to yourself, I'm just no longer going to make toast anymore because it's just not worth the stress of the fire alarm going off. So now this little faulty piece of machinery or poorly tuned piece of machinery has foreclosed on your future of eating toast. And so I think this is a bit of a metaphor for what might be happening in the brain is at one level, and this is some of the earliest studies on things like depression, you'd see this little part of the brain called the amygdala, which is like a salience detector, like an alarm bell going off too much in depression. But as we start to look more at the fulsome experience of what happens over several minutes, for instance, when someone sees a sad movie clip in the scanner, we don't see hyperactivation or too much activity in the sensory parts of the brain, we start to see the consequence of that initial sensation. It's akin to saying, I'm just going to stop cooking because I don't want to have to deal with this alarm going off anymore. But I think the metaphor extends that if you decide you're going to stop cooking, like, well, you have to eat, right? And so what happens when you stop taking in new information is it starts to limit the ability also to notice that things are changing for the better, or even just changing for the neutral, right? Like that nothing wrong is happening right now. We start to lose that ability because we don't want to have to keep processing information that's going to set off the negative alarm bells, but that also we don't know what type of information it is until we've processed it. So we also then are shutting off the door to other types of experiences, including the types of experiences that help us grow out of being stuck in a negative place.
On this podcast, so many guests and listeners are dealing with depression and treatment resistant depression. And it's tough because I don't think many of us have had the option of mindfulness for better mental health. For many, it's still here's your medication and here's weekly talk therapy. And for some, it's working well. But I want to understand the science of sensation and the practice of sense foraging more clearly because it is for everyone at any stage in their lives, not just when you're stressed or depressed. And I'd love some examples.
Yeah, I just would frame it by saying, if you're finding that the meds and talk therapy are working, then I wouldn't say, oh, well, it's not the best thing, I need to abandon it because someone told me, breath work or mindfulness or sense foraging is going to make me this perfect person, right? That's going to be like an impossible standard to hold it for. In treatment resistant depression, as you mentioned, like by definition, the meds or therapy, and if they're helping, aren't helping enough to prevent more episodes from occurring. So there, I think there's really room to think, okay, it's worth the risk, right, of exploring something else. And then a good therapist, skilled psychiatrist, caregiver of any kind is open to trying other things if the first thing's not working. So when we talk about sense foraging, it's specifically to address this possibility that the mind has become so good at automating the way we see the world, at automating the way we respond to the world, that it almost seems like we have no choice in how we see situations, including how we see ourselves or how we respond to those situations. So it's as though this one network that builds habit has become a bit too powerful or too dominant in the brain. Not like that network shouldn't be there, but for people who really feel like it just always shows up as hopeless, or I always just feel powerless, or I know there's other things that other people could do, but I could never do that. That's a sense that habit, this default mode network, has become, we would say, unhelpfully strong. And so the idea then is, well, if you're going to just try to create other stories to interfere with this network, but the network is just deeply programmed, the storytelling network itself is deeply programmed to leave you in a dark or hopeless place, it's a really tough task to use that same network that is not working properly to change the story. So instead, we might ask, well, what are other major functions that the brain is performing that serve to introduce change into our narratives, into our understanding of the world? And the most obvious one, maybe so obvious that it's been somewhat overlooked in the West, is like half of our brain is designed to take in new information through our senses and to literally like make sense of that information. And making sense of that information means abstracting it into narratives, into meanings, into new stories. And if we feel like we're so stressed and so busy that we don't have time for sensation, what we're also kind of saying accidentally is, I don't have time to take in the kind of information, new information that could challenge or change me because I'm so stressed. Right? So it becomes like this kind of trap. But I'm so stressed because I always see the world the same way. I always respond the same way. So sense foraging is trying on the idea that maybe, although it seems useless in the service of the current story, spending time prioritizing sensation could actually shake things up in a helpful way. And by sensation, like concretely, I mean really spending time doing what has no purpose other than to become immersed or absorbed in the sensory qualities of experience. So like right now, I could look around the room that I'm in and try to notice, like, what are parts of this room that just I don't pay attention to. I've learned that it's not useful to look there. There's nothing in it for me. I'm afraid of noticing a spider, whatever it is. Like, I could actually spend some time looking around the room and practicing being curious about what I can see without having to have an obvious output or utility in my life, right? I could try to notice like, well, what does it feel like in my body right now? Just because I'm curious about like, what are the different little pops and crackles of sensation that are occurring in my body, and purposely, again, shelving the idea that it has to play into the current scheme I have of what's important in life. And when we spend some time engaging in sensation, we might notice our thoughts go in different directions, right? Like I might notice um, some old thing in my house, like I can see here a little notebook, and then be curious, like, what did I write in that notebook? Like, when was the last time I used it? I wonder, should I be doing journaling? Like, there's all these things that can show up. And it's not that those things are the truth that's going to set me free, but they're just a break from the rut my mind has learned to move into habitually. And every moment I notice something new and I'm curious about it, my mind has a chance to go into a different direction. And then it's natural for us to be attracted to those directions that seem helpful or soothing, or positive in some way, but we have to be there so we don't miss those opportunities, as opposed to being so caught up in the habits of storytelling that we already have. And so sense foraging is on purpose prioritizing not knowing, being curious, and immersing ourselves in the sensation for a few moments. And over time, we might start to learn that that's an easier mode to slip into. And we can even see that it's available to us in times that we feel really overwhelmed or caught up in our thoughts, caught up in a really strong emotion, to realize that's one film that's playing, that's one story that's playing. But through sensation, we open the door to many other, really infinite other stories if we're willing to pay attention. We can practice that over time.
I'd like to learn more about sense foraging for relief and how that transitions into foraging for insight. With foraging for insight, there's a recognition of your thoughts and a labeling of those thoughts that takes place. And I'd like to understand this transition from relief to insight.
So I think the initial thing that people are going to forage for is for relief. So by that, I mean, there's some sort of pervasive like heaviness or emptiness or worry, and it's just running. You feel like it's running you all the time. Like if you could just like take a break from that, that would already be what we call like negatively reinforcing. It would be great because it's just taking away something bad that we're already doing. So like, it's like the equivalent of like, why are you hitting yourself? Well, if I just wish I knew how to stop. So just immersing oneself in sensation is going to shift resources in the brain away from this habitual elaborative narrative network into the sensory parts of the brain. And it's going to, just by the way our metabolism works, there's limited resources in our metabolism. It's going to take resources out of perpetuating our own negative stories and move it into a more exploratory state where good, bad, and neutral things are available. So that's the relief part of it. And I think that's going to be that should be the initial relatively quick payoff. But the problem is, and I'm sure as I say this, it's naive to think if I do that once, my worries are going to go away. Right. And I know the times that I get triggered, I could spend a couple of minutes being like, oh, let's look at this plant I have. What a nice plant. I feel like a connection to it. I'm happy I get to take care of it and it provides something green in my room full of computers and all that stuff. And then the next second I'll be like, but that thing that person said, and I'll get sucked right back into the story. Right. And so the relief is fleeting because we haven't really dealt with the underlying pattern where we're getting triggered and feeding into the trigger and getting back into rehearsing the negative story. And so as we practice foraging for relief, which means just going into a sensory place and noticing what happens, we will start to also notice that there are sort of habits that we have that become evident by what we get sucked back into. So if I notice that like I keep losing my sense foraging practice because I start thinking about, concerns about an aging parent or issues with a friend or a coworker, these actually become opportunities for insight. The thing that happens that sucks me back in is a thought about this person or this relationship or this past event or this fear for the future. And that moment where we have that thought that sucks us back in also becomes a kind of sensory event, right? We might still end up getting sucked back in and it like 45 minutes later being like, oh, but I meant to be foraging now. I just ruminated for 45 minutes. But maybe there's a little bit of a label there saying like, but it's starting to become familiar how I get myself triggered again, how I get sucked back in. And it's not because you read a book about it or someone told you these are the top 10 triggers or things to watch out for. You start to see these are the things that pull me out of a sensory place back into this sort of analytic, judgmental place. And over time, we can get to know for ourselves, well, how have we become conditioned, right? When I start to feel relaxed, that's when a little alarm bell goes off saying it's not safe to relax. You need to worry about something, right? For someone with anxiety. Or I start to feel a little happy, and that's when the little voice always popped into my head saying like, but you don't deserve happiness. And so you can start to have this insight is like, that's how I'm programmed right now. And just noticing that that's programmed because you saw that little voice, you saw that attentional movement and it became familiar to you. Yeah, there's a labeling there. It doesn't mean you're buying into it in terms of like endorsing and wishing it were so. But before it was just invisible. It was so automatic, so fast that you just thought that was the way things have to be. So now the insight becomes, well, I've gotten used to at such a deep level to rehearsing this, telling myself I'm not valuable or telling myself, something bad is going to happen in the future. I can actually start seeing myself starting to say that automatically when nothing's going on. And that kind of becomes the bridge back into feeling horrible. And then if you notice that happening over time, eventually you can say, oh, that's that familiar thing where I trigger myself. And with enough practice, this probably won't happen in the first or second or fifth day of doing this kind of stuff. You might say, this time I'm actually just going to stay with sensation, right? And I'm going to see what else pops up. And so the labeling is important because it helps us it's not just this like weird foreign threat where all of a sudden we feel horrible anymore. It helps us actually map out, here's like the path I take back into my story. And that can make it easier for us to have some choices when that path becomes obvious that it's presenting itself to us again in the future. So relief is fast, right? As you can stick with sensation, you immediately get some relief because you're just not hitting yourself with the narrative. Insight takes time because you have to see how you fail to stick with sensation repeatedly. And most of us will eventually start to pick up on there's certain patterns. There's a certain way that looks for me. I wonder if I can get better at noticing that, because part of what our awareness actually does is it de-automates automatic processes in our brain. So by bringing that pattern to the forefront, we have the possibility for choice. But I should just say, like, based on my own experience and the research I've done, initially the awareness is just of yourself getting sucked away. It's not like the first time you become aware, now you don't do it anymore. Right? I first started meditating. I thought other people gossip. I never gossip. And then for 2 years, I watched myself gossip and realized that my story about myself wasn't true. And then maybe it's not like even now I've just learned not to believe that I never gossip, but sometimes I could notice, I'm going to start doing that and choose whether I want to do that or not. And other times I just do it anyway. So it's that awareness doesn't make us like, again, perfect people. It just creates an opportunity for us to see the pattern and then decide, is this something I want to work on? If it's something I really care about, maybe I'll try to be more proactive and think about what I'll do the next time this trigger shows up, right? How else could I respond and have a plan for that? And this is something where, these mindfulness or sensory practices really do intersect with having a good friend or a therapist who can help you come up with some of those ideas and remind you of them.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by story and how attention to sensation starves the story a bit
Mm-hmm.
and weakens it.
I think more realistically, there's a motivation that builds when we start to notice that things aren't satisfying or upsetting or frustrating, that can empower us to why it would be worth to like have that effort to try to examine what the stories are. But there's other areas where like every time I talk to this person, I'm just like in a bad place for like a day, right? Or whenever I have a meeting, imagine like I'm having trouble with a student. Every time I meet with that student, I'm grouchy beforehand. I feel exhausted afterwards. I start getting these signals that maybe things could be better, and they're definitely not satisfying the way they are now. And so although that's stressful and the tendency would just be to avoid, like we can't avoid all of our relationships or responsibilities or things like that, or we ought not to. And so that can be sort of motivation for us to say, I'm going to try to spend that extra effort, because it is effort, it is tiring, to do a bit of this foraging while I'm getting into this nasty experience, or what I anticipate to be a nasty experience. I want to start to notice, like, is there anything familiar about how I relate to the experience? What would I think, how I feel, what do I attend to, what I say or do? And I think that's where this idea of going into like what is the story that's running me in this situation becomes kind of worth it, because we know already it's not satisfactory, and so it might be worth putting in the effort to see whether it's other things are available. So yeah, I would like let the suffering kind of point the way as to where it's worth putting in the effort, knowing that because there's negative emotion there, because there's suffering there, the automatic tendency will actually be to shut down taking in sensory information. So if we just hope naturally the insight will emerge, it's actually the kind of conditions where insight is least likely to emerge, because we're least likely to be taking in the type of sensory, granular, like momentary information where insight comes from. So, and to undo that tendency takes effort, right? So it's like called paying attention. Like there's a cost, but if you know upfront you're willing to pay that cost, although it might be a bit rocky, there's an opportunity to notice things that are new in that situation. And over time, the mind can't help but notice new patterns, label what's been going on, and then at that point you can start thinking, wow. Right before I talk to this person, I tell myself like, this is going to be horrible, and that's the last thing I think to myself before the call starts. Every time I do that. So like, I don't know exactly what will make this call less horrible, but maybe that's not helping. Maybe the one thing I'll pick at first is, before this next call, I'll tell myself like, maybe this call will be better than usual or something. You don't have to be like totally Pollyanna-ish about it, but what if I replaced what seems like an obvious negative indicator, negative predictor of the future with something that could be a bit better? And that shows up because I'm motivated to pick at my narratives, and I start noticing a pattern that I predict something really bad right before the bad thing happens. And then, yeah, it's an experiment. You could tell yourself, oh, this call's going to be better than usual. And then it still goes horribly. And you realize, okay, that wasn't the problem, right? Like maybe it's something that's happening during the call. Maybe in the end, this is not a good person for me to be interacting with, right? But rather than just assume, we can play with these different sort of elements, right? It's very common on the internet now. Someone will just be like, oh, just go no contact with that person. It's like, well, if you start doing that every time you have a bad experience, you're going to run out of people soon. So there's a lot more room to negotiate and play with, like, well, what am I adding to the situation? What can I play with in my story before we decide, oh, I'll never have that type of experience again. I'll never talk to that person again, because often there is a way to work through conflict in a way that you can still have healthy relationships with people. It feels like that's always been like a implicit or like culturally transmitted skill that, I mean, there's like a gap now where like we've sort of forgotten how to do that, because it's so easy just to be like, no, I'll just find, there's billions of other people in the world. I can just move on from this relationship, which means we don't get to depth once there's conflict. So suffering motivates us to investigate narratives. We see narratives, we can try to pull at them and see where there's a thread that maybe we could change something about the story we're leaning into, and see if that makes a difference. And then it's about experimenting until you decide either you find some kind of solution or decide, no, I have to move on.
I think you mentioned stories as our superpower.
Yeah, well, I think if you compare us to all other forms of life, I think we're the only ones who have this kind of like extra layer where we conceptualize, like we see ourselves as characters in stories, and our brain responds exquisitely to just what we predict from the world. So when we think we're going to finally get that food we love, it's like you're jazzed up all day. Like, I'm going to eat pizza, right? And you think like, oh, I'm going to have this stressful event coming up. The event itself sometimes pales in comparison to how stressful it was the 12 hours before the event. So we have this ability to project ourselves into the distant past and also into the imagined future, which it seems like it's a relatively unique ability compared to almost any other type of life on Earth. I think what's a bit tragic is we don't realize how much control we have over where we project ourselves. And so we end up projecting ourselves into imagined futures based on just things that have happened to us or things that we're told, right? We focus on things in the past that were emotionally provocative or salient, and there's a bias because of our evolutionary history to be biased towards negative events, because it's more important to avoid negative events for survival than to prioritize positive events where we might not survive them. So we end up just sort of inheriting how the instruction manual for the superpower, but over time we could project ourselves into any imagined future. really, right? Like if I decide I want to project myself into a future where I'm riding an elephant, I could do that. You would be like, why? You're like, I don't know. I want to have some elephant imaginary time. And if I kept doing that, over time, I would probably become more sensitive to opportunities to encounter and maybe even one day ride an elephant. You know what I mean? So, but it all starts with like, what are you up to? And is there even any sort of intention around the things you're foraging for? Right. So when I talk about this idea of projecting ourselves into the future, this is sort of the idea of foraging. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I'm out there looking for, how I could eventually be in this kind of situation. Right. So at the base level, I'm foraging for sustenance. I'm foraging for food in the forest. So I don't starve, but I could be foraging for anything. And they don't have to necessarily be concrete things in terms of like elephants or mushrooms or something like that. It could be what I'm projecting for myself, what I'm foraging for is a sense of connection with other people. Right? Right now, I feel totally lonely and disconnected, and I don't want to tell myself that's not true. That is my lived reality right now. But I also realize I have this power where I could imagine that in some future time, I don't know how I get there. I feel totally connected and like accepted by someone else. Like, I wonder what it would be like to spend some time imagining like being that kind of person. And I don't know how to connect those dots right now. What I'm doing is I'm tuning my attention system to try to notice any sort of thing that resonates or is similar to that simulated experience. So then as I move through life, if I'm talking to someone, I realize like there's an opportunity to share something or to actually respond in a way that shows that like I'm connecting with what they're telling me, it just becomes so much more available because I'm already open to that pathway. Right? Like I've already kind of laid out, okay, in the future, I wish there was a way for connecting. And then I realize someone's telling me about something like, yeah, they're just talking at me like usual. And I'm like, but wait, what if this is a chance for me to connect with them by actually listening to what they're saying? Or I never tell people about myself because they'll just judge me. But like, what if this is a chance to take a risk because maybe they'll connect with what I'm saying? And even playing that game, like not like you're always going to make the right choice, but of like, should I really listen because there's connection available? Should I share something because there's connection available? You won't be having those types of thoughts or making those types of decisions if you're not already playing the game of foraging for connection. It doesn't tell you how to connect the dots to set a foraging attention. It starts you playing the game of looking for opportunities to connect those dots. I would argue if you don't do that, it's just random what happens to you. You're this superpower of like what I should pay attention to, what I should think about in the future, what I should reflect on the past. You're just inheriting it from other people or from advertisements or just by accident, by like that just happens to be where your mind went. And it doesn't have to be that accidental. There can be some portion of your life where you're intentionally choosing the types of things you're trying to predict and notice in the world.
But should you just start looking at leaves?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It starts with relief, right? When you're completely subsumed, like your head is underwater with the intensity of the negative thoughts you're having, there's no room for there to be a competing narrative, right? Like you can introduce something, it's just going to get washed away by how strong the deeply rehearsed narrative is. And so the first step is actually just finding a way to have some space from that narrative by realizing that not all of your experience is that story. How do you add things against a monolithic superpower kind of story that give you a real experience? That's not all there is. Arguably, it's through the senses because they doesn't need to use the same brain resources. Right. And so you can be like, yeah, I'm having this whole big failure monologue playing in my head. And yeah, also there's a leaf, like stupid leaf, like whatever, it spills over. You're like, yeah, but also like green leaf and like it's kind of floating a bit like with the wind. And no, that's a bit interesting. And, so then it's like, okay, I'm a failure and the leaf is kind of dumb and I'm dumb, but also it's kind of floating and it's floating around. And then you're like, okay, all right, well, so like the world is mostly stupid and hopeless, but also there's this kind of wind and leaf thing going on, right? And so like, this is the whole plot of essentially the movie American Beauty, is the guy watching like a plastic bag and being like, my life, like there's things beyond this thing I'm locked into in my life. There's other things that happen in that movie, but like this idea that there can be something profound in just having a sensory experience that just doesn't need to conform with your narrative because it's not being generated just by your mind. It's the world outside being allowed to intrude and have a voice in your experience. And it's only over time, I think, that once we stop being so consumed by that narrative, that there's room to start setting more abstract foraging intentions, like like connection or love or whatever it is. And that's why I think we don't want to idolize like this idea of insight or transformation above relief. Like without relief, none of this stuff is possible. And so how you can find a way to engage yourself enough to break at least partially free from the dominance of the narrative, that becomes its own kind of exploration, right? So some people love, formal meditation. Other people hate it. It's like the worst thing that they can do, right? So don't meditate then, right? It's not just adding stress onto this project of like not being consumed by the narrative, but maybe they enjoy exercise, or they enjoy art, they enjoy music, they enjoy social time with people they know are kind of okay to be around. So we talk a lot later in the book, and in the book Better in Every Sense, about this idea of finding your own access point. I've had people contact me where I think we had a kind of small mention of like someone, an anecdote about someone knitting, and someone emailed me saying like, yes, for me knitting, like psychotherapy didn't work, but my knitting circle like saved my life. And it's just like, cool, like that person found a way to get caught up in the sensory experience in a way that just helped them interfere with the narrative. And for them, it was the knitting needles, right? And by proxy, like the people around them and the community they found there, and all these other things. But there's no way your psychiatrist is likely to say like, yeah, why don't you go try knitting? It's sort of like that becomes a bit of self-discovery, and it involves trying different things, right? Time in nature is another major one, because often anything that is intrinsically beautiful to us, almost by definition, is drawing us into a sensory place. The only thing we really say is sort of guardrails is like these access points themselves shouldn't create more problems than they're helping to solve. So we often don't say like, maybe trying out heroin isn't like a good access point, even if it really pulls you into a sensory bliss kind of state, because it's probably going to create some other problems, right? But there's many other ways to get engaged in sensory experience that are less problematic, even if they're not like obviously wholesome. And so that relief, I think, is where the beginning of stripping away the conditioning of that narrative network begins. And then there's no like in 3 days, 5 days, weeks, months, years, when it's not clear for who at what point, but at some point there will be more space to start conceptually thinking about like, well, what else would I forage for now that my head's no longer just underwater? And I'm still like up to my neck. So like, I wonder if there's another way to improve things in my life. But when people are totally overwhelmed, there's research, not by my group, but many other researchers showing that people know what better advice is, but they just feel like there's no resource to pursue it. So what they choose is distraction or avoidance, because the need for relief is there. The thing about using sensory absorption, sense foraging as the way you try to get relief from the narrative is it can be constructive, it can be generative in a way that going into a very safe, predictable distraction like potato chips or Instagram often is not. It doesn't provide any new grist for the mill. So we argue, and we're trying to show this now with the research, that while distraction is fine, some distraction is more constructive than others. Some distraction leads to more engagement and discovery, and others is just a way of avoiding without doing that. And arguably, the more there's a kind of sensory exploration, a curiosity, and a noticing of things, those are good sort of indicators that it might actually be a constructive way of breaking away or avoiding the narrative.
I'm curious at the clinical level how this can, be brought in to people in acute crisis that are getting referrals to other types of care. I don't know if a lot of mindfulness or sensation is being brought into outpatient psych programs and other places. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that, and if you're seeing some progress, perhaps.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunities through many different existing forms of therapy or support. So, if we think about one of the most basic ways sense foraging shows up in general psychotherapy, talk therapy, there's been a lot more interest in what are called like behavioral activation techniques before you get into like deep, habit changing or cognitive analysis. So what's behavioral activation? It's the idea of setting a small achievable goal where you go and do something in the world where then you can notice that was a real experience that interferes with what would normally happen, which is like nothing or beating yourself up or being worried all day. And so, my somewhat lay understanding of something like behavioral activation is you start the day thinking like I'm 100% useless and never do anything. your behavioral activation contract with like your therapist is, I'm going to do like a 5-minute walk. So you do a 5-minute walk. And then at the end of the day, you're like, I am useless and never do anything almost all the time. But for 5 minutes today, like, that wasn't totally true. So what's happening there is you have like a real lived experience that challenges the narrative. So talking maybe not about, like, if your therapist is super skeptical, or whoever your the caregiver person you're trying to get support, and they don't like any of this mindfulness woo-woo stuff, you can say like, what about behavioral activation or savoring practices, another term that's often used. You try to identify real aspects of your experience that you can notice right now that break from the negative narrative. I think this kind of stuff is really hard to bootstrap up on your own. Like it does, especially when you're really acutely suffering. There is a really good evidence base for things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which my co-author Zindel Siegel helped to found. But there might not be a therapy center anywhere near you, right, where you can do these like group manualized therapies. There are online versions of it. You can sign up. So Zindel and another researcher, Sona Demijan, created something called mindful noggin. Like noggin is a funny word for head, I guess, where you can take like a simulated 8-week mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course. And that specific course is for resilience against recurrent depression, right? And so there's an evidence base for those types of programs, I think more so for the live versions, but still pretty good evidence for the online version, that it's one of the few things you can do from a psychotherapy perspective that's been proven to make it safe to go off of medication. I'm not going to necessarily say like for your bipolar audience to go off the like antipsychotic meds, but the studies that have been done have been people with recurrent depression who have responded to antidepressant medication. And so one of the most famous studies, they had 3 groups. One group of people just stayed on their antidepressant medication, and they had relatively low relapse rates because the medication was working for them. So still some people relapse. And then there are 2 other groups. In one group, they were given placebo and slowly, I guess, weaned off of their antidepressants. And in the 3rd group, they were given placebo and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And in the placebo alone group, they relapse at much higher rates, which kind of shows that the drugs were really helping. And if you just take people off the drugs and be like, yeah, you just try to remember to be positive, like that's not good enough. But the 3rd group that had gone off antidepressants and done mindfulness-based cognitive therapy showed no higher relapse rates than the people who stayed on their medication. So it created evidence that there's actually an exit strategy for lifetime of antidepressant use if you're also learning how to use these skills in a structured, supported way. And so a lot of what's happening in a course like this is getting homework, right? And then having weekly meetings to talk about doing that homework, about going into your senses, exploring, first finding some relief, just even going into the senses, then eventually using some cognitive therapy techniques to say like, well, what are some of the patterns you're noticing that look like triggers for relapse for you? And how do you learn to accept that those triggers are actually occurring so that you can see them, maybe de-automate them in a way. So, it's just because of my background. Like I said, people preach what they've been taught. Like I'd give a thumbs up to looking for some kind of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy if you're dealing with depression specifically, and there are online versions of that. But I think back to your point, like when someone is acutely like in episode or going through a relapse, like that's not the best time to again go for like rewrite the whole script. It's a time to find like support and relief, but in a way that is open to engaging in some of these exploration practices and trying to find a therapist, psychiatrist who's able to help you counsel you into something that involves elements of behavioral activation, not just like getting the meds right. I think is a great way to use that medical language to ask for sense foraging. And then realize like if you just do the walk and you ruminate for the whole 5 minutes of the walk, probably it's not going to change things so much, but you could use that next walk to change your attentional habits a little bit. And each day it can change a little bit more.
And there's research also that positive thinking can really predict how you recover from an episode.
I think the trick is like positive thinking can be sort of at least like 2 different things. One is like you just say things to yourself, but you don't believe them. And you're essentially trying to like gaslight yourself because you're not supposed to say the bad things. And then there's also positive thinking, which is, I think, has more of like an authenticity to it where you're actually noticing positive aspects in your life that are real to you. And again, those might not be available at the narrative level, but they probably are showing up every day at the experiential level, right? Many of us are still privileged to have like food, shelter, some security, some positive interactions in each day. And those could be things you choose intentionally to focus on in this attempt to rewire your mental habits. And so thinking like not only about that sort of foraging in the moment for these moments of positivity, but a sort of overarching motivation that's sort of an optimism that's saying like, I can learn more about my mind and I can actually practice the skill of picking up on my experience in a positive or at least curious sort of way. Is something that we call it in the clinical research biz, like decentering, right? And this, if you think of this as a form of positive thinking, which is like noticing to be curious about your experience in a sort of open or kind or tolerant way, if you see this kind of pattern of decentering or positive thinking, if you want to call it like that, I call it that, grow over time. In our own research on people with recurrent depression, that's the best self-report indicator that someone is going to stay healthy, to not relapse. Whereas the idea that if you could just get rid of like leftover symptoms after an episode, if you could just take those to zero, you wouldn't relapse, doesn't seem realistic because symptoms just spike, right? Like sometimes it's bad chemistry that day. Sometimes like something bad actually happens and it triggers all kinds of things. So if the idea is like, I'm going to be positive by making sure I don't feel bad, you're going to fail. It's not like a realistic goal. So when we look at like 2-year follow-up data and people who do some of these training programs, sometimes it's mindfulness, sometimes it's other kinds of therapy, you see symptoms, as they've come out of episode have gone down. So they're not like considered clinically depressed anymore, but then it just kind of like wiggles around. Like they have a good month, they have a bad month. It's not like it goes to zero and stays down there. But decentering, right? This ability to take on this mindset and can feel like you're discovering things about your mind, and you're also learning to do it in a positively framed way. Like it's good to even discover a bad habit because now there's maybe a chance to affect the habit. That continues to grow. It grows in therapy and it grows even more in the 2 years following up for the people who stay well. And so what they're learning to do is make this part of like their daily philosophy of like, well, what can I learn from this? What can I notice about my experience? If I'm realizing I'm getting into a deep pattern of rumination or negative self-judgment, like, can I at least see what's triggering that? Can I notice like, of course it's happening because like, that's what I've learned to do, and not then, give myself that second beating of like being wrong for doing that, but actually be like, okay, at least I'm learning to discover and notice that happening. And that's a positive thing. That's a real positive thing, right? It's better to have the awareness than not have the awareness. That can continue to grow, grow to levels that are much higher even than at the end of an 8-week course of therapy. And like statistically, like then we went to like the nerd space, like that is a significant predictor of reduced relapse risk. This idea of growing in this decentering capacity. And then arguably part of what lets you do that is you are tuned into actual experience where you have these authentic moments of insight. You're not just telling yourself, oh yeah, I'm getting better every day, when really nothing is changing.
So there's a lot of hope there. And I'll share with listeners some resources.
It doesn't have to be like a mindfulness class. Like if you hate that stuff, but you like doing exercise, or let's say you like working with your hands, right? You could take a gardening class, or I signed up for a bike repair class at like the local high school, like adult learning to start in January. Cause I know it'll just be like winter and I'll be like, oh, everything sucks. And like, at least it'll get me like out there and I'll be like, literally getting my hands dirty, but like doing something I'm interested in because I'm interested in cycling. So, on the face of it, that's not therapy. Like, how can it help? But if we follow this logic of like, this is going to give me some structure where I know I'm like every week I'm going to do something, I'm going to be discovering things, and using my senses and using my body. It doesn't have to be like a cardio class or a meditation session to be useful, right? We just want to be able to find that access point that supports us to do something that's like interactive and using our sensory motor system, and realizing that can help us that can help be a source of insight. That's part of that positive thinking, that positive mindset that can continue to grow over time. I love how you ended saying like there's a hopeful note here that if we have that openness that things can change and are willing to explore our senses, I really think things they really will. And it starts with that first it is a bit of a leap of faith. You're like, oh, I heard some podcasts, so I guess now I'm going to look at some leaves for a while. Like you kind of have to take it on faith that there might be something there. But all of our research and lots of different anecdotal evidence over the years suggest that there's a possibility. So better than condemning yourself to being stuck. I would say it's worth a try.
Great. Thank you so much. I really
Thanks.
appreciate your time.
Thank you.